With its invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Russia delivered a proverbial double tap to the peace dividend and transformed the international arms market almost overnight. Global demand for a range of systems and munitions skyrocketed, just as one of the major suppliers, Moscow, was mostly fading from the market picture. Last episode, I covered some of the results of that disruption 3 years on, particularly surging US export sales and a lot of demand focused on Europe. But trends seldom continue forever, and in the last couple of weeks, we've seen another major disruption. As the war in the Middle East has in some cases consumed years' worth of munition production in a matter of weeks, and once again sent global demand spiking, right as the United States, which many other countries have been looking to for their supplies, suddenly has its own pressing needs and magazines to worry about. And so today, building on last episode, I want to look at recent events and what they might mean for the global defence sector, looking not just at updated estimates of how many munitions the United States, Israel and other countries in the region are consuming, but also what it might mean for some of the other players in the market if international demand spikes again on account of the global security environment being what it is, while the US defence industrial base might be too focused on restocking the Pentagon to pick up much of the slack and the contracts the way it did after 2022. Now, given I'm recovering from surgery this week, I'm going to try and make this a slightly shorter episode, but we still have a fair amount of ground to cover. We'll start with a quick refresher of how the arms market was squeezed, with high demand and low supply between 2022 and 2024, and then how some of the major events of 2025 and 2026 might start to apply that pressure again, looking at factors like the consumption of thousands of high-end munitions over the last couple of weeks in the Middle East, and a surge in purchases by buyers, especially in the Gulf states, that are arguably growing a lot faster than American production can. Then, to demonstrate the potential implications, we'll focus on one of the most overtaxed areas of the market, air defence, and why this might be a bit of a make or break moment for the likes of European or Korean suppliers, with ambitions to jump in and fill any vacuum between supply and demand. But before we get to the disruption and multi-billion-dollar interceptor fireworks shows of 2026, we need to remember why munition supply, including many NATO states, was under pressure well before US bombs started falling on Iran. As we said last week, the arms market of 2025 was very much a reflection of the preceding years. First, the COVID supply chain squeezes had come for the defence industrial base the same as they'd come for everything else. Almost no matter what country you're talking about, output slowed and costs went up. But that was okay, many planners thought at the time, because they understood that a lot of them had significant stockpiles left over from the Cold War, or the campaigns and crises of the 2000s and 2010s. So the thinking may have been in some corners that as long as no other major international emergency occurs, everything was going to be fine. Putin would then kick off said second international emergency in 2022, which amplified the problem from 3 directions at once. One, quite rightly, Ukraine was now consuming a lot of those pre-war stockpiles in order to fight back the Russians. 2, the energy shock that came with the Russian invasion was causing a second supply shock in the defence industrial base. And 3rd, just as stockpiles were being drawn down, a lot of countries were realising that, hey, war might be a threat again, and war tends to consume a shit ton of ammunition, and therefore they started revising their target stockpile levels up, meaning now industry had to output enough not just to replace what was being supplied to Ukraine, but perhaps even more importantly in terms of quantity, to refill national magazines and equipment parks to the point where countries would feel adequately prepared for the new, more dangerous world they now seem to inhabit. But in many cases, the rebuilding of the defence industrial base to meet those needs charitably fell a bit short in places in terms of both size and scale. Some firms had to wait literal years for orders to ramp up production, meaning that while, for example, European ammunition production started to dial up, it did so a lot more slowly than assessed demand. Especially given, as you may have noticed, in terms of geopolitical tensions and conflicts, it's not just Russia and Ukraine. That's by far the largest consumer of munitions. But wars, skirmishes or tensions, short or long, also pushed a lot of other countries to revise their requirements for defence preparedness as well. India and Pakistan, Middle East and North Africa, significant chunks of Asia and Oceania all come to mind here. And to top it all off, in a lot of technological categories, the world was also seeing countries go through a kind of generational changeover. Globally, a lot of countries had entered the 90s with a glut, essentially, of munitions and equipment left over from the 60s, 70s and 80s. But more than 30 years on from the fall of the wall, a lot of that stuff was aging out or becoming effectively irrelevant, and replacement was often becoming more of an essential rather than a nice-to-have. The end result, as we saw last episode, was significant investments and defence firms often carrying massive backlogs. In 2025, for example, the French manufacturer Dassault surpassed its annual plan of 25 Rafale deliveries by handing over 26. That was up from 21 in 2024, of which 14 had gone to France and 7 to export customers. But in the same year, the country recorded new orders for about, you guessed it, 26 additional Rafales, meaning the total order backlog fell from 220 at the end of 2024 to 220 at the end of 2025. At current production rates, if you were to decide you want a small package of these French fighters and were to order them and go to the back of the queue, you might be expecting to get your first deliveries in about 9 years. From an industrial planning and capital utilisation perspective for firms, this is a fantastic situation. 9 years of backlog means you can certainly invest in long lead time items, in training up staff, in building up your facilities. But for countries that might feel a need for something a bit sooner than 2035, the pressure might often be to go to suppliers who could potentially deliver sooner, and/or where integration into the existing force might be easier. That naturally made one of the greatest arms export winners of the 2022 through 2025 period the established incumbent, the United States. In the first 3 years of the war in Ukraine, the US hit post-Cold War arms export record after record, and there was plenty of reason to expect that was going to happen. In a number of categories, especially some expensive categories, US products didn't really have equivalent competitors. If you were a European state, for example, and you wanted a fifth-generation fighter and weren't willing to pull off the active geopolitical twister necessary to buy from Beijing, your options were always going to be F-35, F-35, or F-35. And geopolitically, for a lot of the cashed-out buyers out there, be they in Europe or the Middle East, the US was considered a reliable and preferred supplier. In a lot of cases, new-build American equipment might not be the cheapest stuff on the table, but it was often supported by hot production lines, a battle-proven record, meaning that from a lot of countries, from a strategic perspective, they could probably do worse than getting strapped with the best Made in America had to offer. In fiscal year 2024, US sales reached nearly $319 billion US, only to rise even further in fiscal 2025 to $331 billion, which gets us to the two major curveballs that hit the market in 2025 and 2026. One, Iran, which we'll get to in a moment, which supercharged demand, and another, which impacted where countries wanted to buy from where possible. In terms of potential impacts on the international defence sector, the American and Israeli decision to attack Iran has a couple of parallels and differences to 2022. On the demand side, the invasion put massive oh shit levels of upward pressure on global spending and also started rapidly consuming material, especially in a couple of key categories. Think artillery shells and missiles, armour and artillery systems, and then especially later on, air defence systems and air defence munitions. On the supply side, it mostly removed Russia from the equation. They often started delaying deliveries and sales volumes collapsed, both because of sanctions and geopolitics, but also the need to prioritise the Russian MOD. In an example of Economics 101 playing out to its natural conclusion, that growth in demand, coupled with a decrease in supply, ultimately created opportunities for other suppliers like the United States, France and Korea to jump in and get more sales and scale than they may otherwise have been able to achieve. By comparison, the war in the Middle East is also driving up demand and consumption, but arguably for different types of munitions. Ukraine has consumed cannon artillery shells by the millions, but in the absence of any surprise superguns that can yeet a shell from Tehran to Tel Aviv, they haven't really been much of a feature of this war. Instead, the consumption has mostly been focused on ballistic missiles and drones for the Iranians, and then cruise missiles, various air-launched munitions and air defence interceptors for the Americans, Israelis and GCC states. Like 2025, it also impacts global threat perception and political urgency, while also giving a major supplier, in this case the United States, something to think about other than just its export customers, because a lot of the munitions being used are coming straight out of American reserves. Now to be clear, the Pentagon has stockpiled an absolute shit ton of weapons, but the scale of the air and missile campaigns in the Middle East is such that even a couple of weeks of combat operations has been enough to make a significant impression. At the moment, you could argue the kinetic side of the war really focuses on two major elements. The air and missile campaign, where Iran continues to sling ballistic missiles and drones, while the US and Israelis carry on with an air campaign. And then, as anyone who's filled up at a petrol station recently would be well aware, there's also an ongoing Iranian quasi-A2AD effort targeting the Strait of Hormuz. That second element doesn't actually involve that many strikes, but the first one has seen a whole bunch of munitions being expended. In terms of how that effort is going, I know that narratively it can seem like both sides are in almost separate universes. Just today, at time of recording, Iranian media insists that they've just sunk 3 American ships with a large number of American fatalities, while the White House has been insisting for some time now that the war has already been won. A statement which doesn't feel entirely consistent with the world in which the IRGC is still launching missiles, and traffic through the strait has slowed to a crawl. Those claims and how the conflict might actually be going are something I want to unpick in a future episode. All we really care about today is how quickly both sides have been blowing through munitions in the process. Tracking Iranian missile and drone launch rates is difficult, but what we can see on screen here is one ongoing effort. This relies on reporting by the Ministries of Defence in the GCC states as well as Israel, and it appears to show a continuation of a pattern we saw develop relatively early on. Initially, there was a massive surge in Iranian ballistic missile and drone attacks. Then those numbers rapidly came down as launches were destroyed, suppressed, or kept in reserve. And since then, we've seen a relatively steady daily cadence of missile and drone launches. In total, that data tracks a total of 1,530 cruise and ballistic missiles and 4,115 Iranian drones. As at time of recording, the most recent day of data had the Iranians firing 25 ballistic and cruise missiles and 40 drones. That's a bit of a low ebb by the standard of the last couple of weeks, so I'd probably expect to see at least some higher numbers in the coming days. To put that in perspective, that suggests that Iran is now launching far fewer drones against its neighbours than Russia is against Ukraine. Moscow's most recent large-scale attack against the Ukrainians involved almost 1,000 one-way attack drones, for example. And Russia's Ministry of Defense recently claimed to have shot down about 390 Ukrainian drones in a single night, suggesting a Ukrainian drone attack beyond the scale of anything Iran has managed since roughly day 4 of the war. But the launch cadence for cruise and ballistic missiles is still larger than what Russia would usually manage. And if some of the reporting that's already come out is to be believed, the defenders haven't always been conservative when it comes to firing interceptors to bring them down. It's reported that some Ukrainian air defense specialists, for example, who've already arrived in the region and claimed their first Shahed kills, may have been, to put it politely, somewhat surprised by just how willing certain countries in the region are to ripple off the kind of expensive interceptors that the Ukrainians themselves have to very carefully husband. And if we look at some of the munitions expenditure estimates, you'll see what I mean. What you're seeing on screen here are estimates by just one organisation, the Payne Institute, charting best guess munition consumptions for the first 16 days of the war by the US, Israeli and Allied forces across some selected munitions categories. Just to flag that with an asterisk then, it is just one organisation's estimate, and by this point it's already a number of days outdated. There's some reporting that suggests that Tomahawk number, which is around 500 on the chart there, might actually be closer to 800 than it is 500, but let's go with these figures for a moment. What it suggests is that against roughly 1,500 Iranian ballistic and cruise targets, as well as thousands of drones, Allied forces have fired nearly 500 ground-based higher-tier interceptors, so Arrow and THAAD, about 2,000 ground-based mid-tier interceptors, that's mostly Patriot, with the largest segment being PAC-3 interceptors fired by the Gulf countries, and then north of 600 air-to-air missiles, which I've limited there to the likes of AMRAAM, AIM-9, and things like the European Mica. They also expressed estimates in terms of percentage of pre-war stockpiles, and I've included some of those on the chart here. By these estimates, the first 16 days of the war consumed about 80% of Israel's Arrow 2 and 3 interceptors, about 60% of the Talon interceptors for the THAAD batteries operated by the Gulf states, roughly half of Israel's inventory of Stunner interceptors for David Sling, about 40% of America's Talons, 30% of the PAC-3 interceptors for the Gulf states other than Saudi Arabia, and on the lower end, between 15 and 20% of America's Patriot inventory, Israel's Tamir interceptors for Iron Dome, and the European Aster interceptors used by Qatar's Navy. On one hand, these estimates suggest that the involved countries probably aren't going to run out of things like Patriot interceptors tomorrow, especially given the massive drop-off in Iranian missile launches that we've seen since the earliest stages of the war. On the other hand, if you're anywhere close to firing 2 years' worth of Patriot production off in a little over 2 weeks, then yeah, that's probably going to cause a revision in someone's market estimate somewhere. As the war pushes into its second month, these estimates are obviously going to be outdated, though I do think we have reason to believe that the consumption of a lot of high-end munitions on a daily basis has fallen as the campaign goes on. One of the potential big indicators here is we recently got footage of American B-52s apparently taking off for strikes against Iran, loaded with JDAMs. In terms of the assessed threat from Iranian ground fire, the B-52 is kind of the biggest, fattest canary in the coal mine. On the sliding scale that has the likes of the B-2 and F-22 at one extreme, the buff sits relatively squarely at the other. And we continue to see B-52s taking off for strikes with a full load of JASSM cruise missiles long after we'd started to see other US platforms switch over to loading up with JDAMs instead. That doesn't mean Iran's air defences are entirely gone, or that standoff strikes will stop, especially in those areas that are harder to reach or where Iranian air defences might be comparatively more intact. You should expect there to be parts of Iranian airspace where, as recent events indicate, even an F-35 might not be entirely safe, while in other places the environment is permissive enough that the likes of the A-10 and B-52 can go to work. But it might suggest it's less likely that America burns through another year worth of JASSM production in the coming weeks, the same way it may well have done in the first 3. The other way to interpret the data, though, is that even if consumption rates might be falling, they've still been market-bendingly high. If the roughly 2,000 mid-tier interceptor figure is accurate, for example, there might have been more Patriot interceptors fired in the Middle East over the course of a week than Ukraine has received over the course of the entire war. Sure, that doesn't account for the Ukrainians burning through a lot of other interceptors, like their stockpile of S-300s that they began the war with. But whatever the case, if you're letting rip with multi-million-dollar interceptors at anything like that kind of rate, even if things do later slow down, that's the kind of burn rate you can expect to have impacts for years to come. With the big point here being that compared to the world of December 2025 or January 2026, you now have a case where some US defence production is going to be pulled in new directions. If in 2023 or 2024, for example, there might have been room to prioritise Ukraine near the top of the list, now you have an additional number of US allies or partners who are also facing active missile attack, no longer have the same stockpiles they once did, and might be somewhat insistent that Uncle Sam try to arrange the defence industry equivalent of next-day shipping. And one piece of extra evidence for that is that we've already seen the US start to push through emergency arms sales to some of these impacted countries. The first emergency sale we saw pushed through came about 20 days ago at time of recording, with the US announcing an emergency sale of about $650 million worth of munitions to Israel, the largest single component of that being about 12,000 1,000-pound bombs. One imagines those will most likely be paired with a JDAM guidance kit or equivalent, and used to replace a lot of the munitions the Israelis have been dropping. The follow-on emergency sales we saw to the GCC countries, though, were much more expensive and much more defensively focused. Forget $600 million, these might all up reportedly total north of $20 billion. Meaning by some estimates, at least in the first phase of the war, the US may have been selling munitions and equipment almost as quickly or even faster than it was actually consuming it itself. And if you dig into them, both the what and how much can potentially tell us a lot. One of the largest single sales is from Kuwait, with the prime items being 8 lower-tier air and missile defence sensor radar. Now, for those of you not in the know, the name here might be slightly deceptive. A lot of people might hear the words lower tier and make the mistake of thinking these things are cheap. They're not, which makes sense, given you'd normally expect to see this thing as part of a Patriot system. It's a 360-degree view system, can see further than a lot of competitors, like a bunch of fancy modern sensors that takes advantage of gallium nitride technology, and they are very, very new. The Kuwaitis have ordered 8 of these systems along with supportive equipment, with an estimated price of a casual $1 billion each. Jordan, which isn't one of the GCC states, but which has also pushed through an emergency request, by comparison, isn't spending anywhere near as big, about $70 million for aircraft and munition support. But the United Arab Emirates, which has been on a receiving end of a plurality of Iranian missiles and drones so far, is very much giving the Kuwaitis a run for their money, although spreading that over multiple different orders. This FMS, for example, relates to the sale of 400 recent model AMRAAMs to the Emiratis, along with the usual package of support equipment and a couple of spare guidance sections for a casual $1.2 billion. That one, I think, is notable for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it indicates that, as we previously suggested, air-to-air munitions like AMRAAM are also being used against Iranian drones, not just ground-based interceptors. Secondly, it suggests the United States might not be handing out mates rates pricing here. The UAE is already an AMRAAM operator, so you can't imagine the support, logistics and training component would be that expensive. And yet, at $1.2 billion for 400 missiles, you're sitting around $3 million a shot. That is well north of what the US Air Force itself typically pays, and much closer to what we saw announced for Denmark and Germany back in 2025, with the Germans cleared for a $1.2 billion purchase of 400 more advanced D-model AMRAAMs that was announced in September 2025. So you could say these sales do appear to be taking place at going market rates, if you like. The final point to note is that puts even more pressure on the current AMRAAM backlog. Despite AIM-260 being in the pipeline, AMRAAM's one of those American munitions that's in the middle of a production scale-up push. But even if you don't count any demand from the US itself, tracked orders from foreign countries total about 900 in 2025. Tack on an additional 400 from the Emirates, and unless the US Air Force wants to go entirely without for a while, we're probably looking at a situation where the backlog is continuing to grow. Then we interestingly saw an emergency offensive munition package for the UAE, this time focused on F-16 munitions. Key highlights, 1,500 small diameter bombs and 1,200 JDAM guidance kits, as part of a wider $600+ million package. Now, there is potentially an interesting question to ask here. So far, we've seen the Gulf states, including the Emiratis, stand pretty much on the defensive against the Iranian missile and drone attacks. The question may be asked then, why would an offensive munition package be waved through as an emergency requirement, bypassing the usual congressional review? The FMS notification itself doesn't provide a huge number of hints in that respect, simply saying the sale will improve the Emirates' ability to defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity to meet its national defence requirements. But whether the intention here is signalling, deterrence, potential future use, or some combination thereof, only time and where the bombs eventually end up will ultimately tell. Then, to change things up a bit, after 2 major emergency sales to the UAE, we have 2 more emergency sales to the UAE. This is basically a radar for the Terminal High Altitude Air Defence System and an all-you-can-eat buffet of supporting material. Fire control and communication station, launch and control stations, array faces, 5 years of sustainment support, you name it. Based on satellite images, it was very clear the Iranians went after THAAD sites across the region pretty much right out of the gate. Some of those strikes demonstrably hurt. And while exactly how much damage was done across the board still isn't entirely clear, orders like this one certainly seem to suggest that some customers, like the UAE, might be looking to replace or augment their inventories as quickly as possible. One of the major threats to some of these very sensitive, very expensive installations and pieces of equipment hasn't just been Iranian ballistic missiles, it's also been the Iranian drone threat. And so we saw the announced purchases for the UAE rounded out, with a roughly $2 billion after-the-fact purchase, covering 10 American FS LIDs, so fixed site, low, slow, small unmanned aircraft integrated defeat systems, as well as a 240-pack of Coyote interceptors for it. As far as CUAS solutions go, this is not a cheap one, but it likely suggests the Emirates want something as soon as possible, and given their existing relationship, are willing to pay top dollar for an American solution. Suffice to say, 250 Coyotes isn't a huge number of interceptors, but the intention may be to just get the sites and sensors operational as soon as possible with as many interceptors as can be pulled together quickly, and then stock up on additional interceptors in following orders. We don't know. What we do know, as we'll get to a bit later on, is it suggests there might be a lot of money and demand in the pipeline for counter-drone solutions, to a greater extent than we saw come through in the 22 through 25 data. The core point I'm trying to get to is that while the political developments in 2025 might have put some downward pressure on foreign demand for US systems and munitions, the current war in the Middle East has created a massive demand pressure in the other direction. You have a bunch of relatively wealthy US-aligned countries that have burned through a lot of munitions very quickly, and in some cases lost some fairly valuable equipment to Iranian strikes, who have a massive imperative to replace some of that stuff as soon as they possibly can. The complicating factor from a US export perspective is the demand picture might actually slingshot too far, because a lot of the demand isn't just going to be coming from export customers like the GCC states, it'll be coming from the US military itself. There's already been reported chatter on a potential $200 billion supplemental being taken to the US Congress, essentially as an Iran war supplemental. Just with the funding packages we saw for Ukraine, I think it's likely that a lot of that requested funding is going to relate either to munitions and equipment, or funding up to dial up production thereof. Now, on the assumption that's true and something like this is eventually approved, then in the medium to long term, if production is successfully scaled up, it might provide the US the opportunity and scale to come back and contest more foreign contracts. Even before the war started, we'd already seen announcements of an intention to lift production in major munitions categories. A 7-year framework agreement was meant to see AMRAAM production lift from about 1,000 a year to 1,900, SM6 output was meant to jump to 500 per year, and Tomahawk output was meant to jump to about 1,000 per annum, at which rate the 850 used against the Iranians so far would be closer to 10 months production rather than multiple years' worth. As we saw in Ukraine, the procurement thinkers over at the Pentagon are never ones to waste a crisis. And so just as those Ukraine supplementals funded US scale-ups in the past, we should probably expect to see more of the same here. But even if that sort of supplemental passes, the key factor here is time, because the demand is now, and the supply created might be several years down the track. And so, at least in the short term, I think it's likely we see a potential congestion scenario, where other countries are turning up and saying that they need new equipment and munitions and that time is absolutely a factor. At the same time, the Pentagon is turning up and saying, sorry guys, we got to go first here. If we end up in that situation, it's possible we see nations purchasing from non-American suppliers, not necessarily because that's their first preference, but because they'd like delivery sometime before 2042. Essentially, by kicking off the war in the Middle East, the US may have created more additional short-term domestic and international demand than its defence industrial base is in a position to meet, and that has potential implications for some of the arms flow we might see in coming years. One final thing to note, before we move on from the war in the Middle East to specific systems categories, is this war churning through munitions the way it is creating demand ripples in places you might not expect. It's not just the US, Gulf states and Israel, for example. We've also seen the French announce a roughly $10 billion munition top-up package. That's reportedly worth about 8.5 billion euros or 10 billion American dollars, and is meant to be bolted onto the existing 16 billion euro munition budget running out to the year 2030. Now, part of the motivation there might have more to do with the war in Ukraine, French security requirements, and events well outside the Middle East. But it's worth noting that despite some of the rhetoric on the topic, some NATO states have been pretty actively engaged in the Middle East throughout this war, and are burning through munitions in the process. French and British aircraft, for example, are both flying missions against incoming Iranian drones. While it might be fair to characterise this as a primarily defensive deployment, it's hard to argue it doesn't make things easier from the United States from an offensive perspective. The American air effort currently has to be split between defensive and offensive sorties. There are fighters that go up and shoot down incoming cruise missiles and Shaheds, while others push into Iranian airspace and deliver offensive munitions. All else being equal, if these Rafales and Eurofighters weren't flying these missions, someone else would have to do it instead. And I think the reasonable expectation is they're going to be blowing through air-to-air munitions in the process. Other allies might not be spending munitions so much as equipment service hours. Australia sent an E-7 AWACS aircraft to the UAE, for example, to help patch the overall sensor picture. Potentially all the more relevant, given the US appears to have recently lost one of its own E-3 AWACS aircraft, as you can see here, to an Iranian strike. From an air defence perspective, that's a way to potentially help without spending any missiles in the process. But there are only so many of those aircraft to go around, and they're not exactly free to keep in the air. The point is, in a lot of equipment categories, the war in the Middle East has accelerated the global equipment and munition burn, in some cases much more quickly than the war in Ukraine already was. And as well as US capacity being stretched to meet all this demand, we also need to acknowledge another geopolitical factor in terms of how this is all likely to play out from here. It probably suffices to say that 2025 saw a significant change in the transatlantic relationship between the United States and many of its European allies. Technically, of course, alliances like NATO are still very much in place, but when you have stories claiming that Allied troops might have been sent to Greenland with supplies of explosives, so they could sabotage runways in the event of a potential American landing, it's probably fair to say the relationship might have shifted slightly, and with it, national buying preferences. For European countries in particular, the stated political goal often became one of diversification, not removing American systems from the inventory so much as making sure that going forward, more money was being spent in Europe on European systems. Sometimes these requirements were implicit, in other cases they were explicitly written into key mechanisms. The Massive Security Action for Europe program, for example, SAFE, which provided something like 150 billion euros worth of cheap long-term loans to member states that wanted to invest in defence, required that procurement contracts the program was funding had no more than 35% of their total component cost coming from outside the EU, EEA, or Ukraine. That meant if you were a country like Poland, for example, which had more than 43 billion euros worth of defence investments signed off by the Commission under the programme, at absolute most, 15 of that could be directed to traditional non-European Polish suppliers like the United States and to a limited extent South Korea. I've sometimes seen it argued that mechanisms like SAFE mean we should expect Europe to be spending less on American weapons in the near future. But in absolute terms, that's really not necessarily true. Remember, when we're talking about SAFE or future budgets, we're talking about defence spending in Europe significantly increasing. And as we covered last episode, a lot of that increase going specifically to the purchase of new equipment. In a base case scenario where there'd be no change in the transatlantic relationship in 2025 and buying patterns stayed the same as they had previously, then you would have likely expected the US to grab a majority of the created import demand. According to SIPRI, for the period 2021 through 2025, the US supplied about 60% of the imported arms to European NATO states. Instead, under a program like SAFE, the maximum percentage the United States can get is capped at that 35%, and that's assuming no other external supplier like Korea manages to get so much as a look-in. As long as European defence investments are increasing super rapidly, it's possible for two things to be true at the same time. You can have the percentage of sales that America is securing falling, at the same time that total sales still look really robust or even increasing. But from a long-term market competition perspective, that might still be really, really important, as we'll go through more a little bit later on. Another fact to consider here is that a lot of spending is taking place in categories where America doesn't really have a relevant market entrant. Two big-ticket investment areas for a lot of European states since 2022, for example, have been frigates and conventional submarines. The US hasn't produced a conventional submarine in a very, very long time, and as for their record designing and producing frigates, perhaps the less said about that the better. Instead, the surface warship category has seen a lot of contracts going to traditional producers like the United Kingdom, Italy and France, while German U-boats have continued to be the main relevant player in the underwater domain. The same also applies on the flip side, categories where there's not much competition or alternative to US imports, with the F-35 and munitions for it continuing to win contracts and make deliveries, despite the push we've seen from many buyers to try and localise as much as possible. That said, looking out to 2026 and beyond, it's clear the question of just how much some of the major buyers want to move away from American supply really remains unsettled. Part of the reason for the unknown here is you'd expect political and economic factors to be pulling in different directions. Because European states, for example, have been committed to increasing the amount of defence spending they do on a very significant level, As long as European capitals can resist the temptation to buy 16 different systems in every category, which is never a guaranteed outcome, it's likely to be much more viable for European alternatives to achieve the scale necessary to really compete with American options. Basically, a European defence ecosystem at 2.5 or 3.5% of GDP is just going to be big enough that you can often set up a US or Chinese-style production line for a relevant system, and so potentially be competitive on cost with imports while still localising economic benefits. On the flip side, we've seen some reporting that Washington's made it fairly clear that that isn't the outcome they want. The reported preference from the Pentagon appears to be that allies dial up their defence spending and become more independent of the United States, yes, but not to the extent that they stop buying from or relying on US suppliers. The point is, behind the data from 2025, there was already pressure on countries and companies to build up alternatives to American supplies. And all else being equal, if nothing else had changed, in a number of years, we might have expected to start see that flowing through to US sales figures. However, this is the 2020s. All else seldom remains equal for long, and so now we have the added complication of a war in the Middle East and the massive munition consumption that's gone with it to potentially complicate things even further. So, here's a question. If there is going to be pressure on available supplies in the international market in the near future, where might we expect those to show up in future export figures, especially when it comes to the United States? Because unless something dramatic changes, I think it's fair to say that the impact is likely to be highly unequal. If you're talking about traditionally America's most valuable defence export, combat aircraft, the impact is probably going to be relatively minimal. The Gulf states aren't ordering a rush of new jets, and unless the Ghost of Kuwait goes for ace status, American manned aircraft losses so far have been a very small proportion of the overall fleet. There's also more than enough backlog to keep a lot of the industry busy. In 2025, SIPRI estimated the US had more than 930 fixed-wing combat aircraft and 250 combat helicopters on its export order book, which in the fixed-wing category was nearly 6 times as many as Russia and China combined. As for what is often the second largest category of global arms exports, ships and submarines, again, there's probably not much to see here. And while there might be some squeeze between US restocking requirements and allies that use missiles like Tomahawk, perhaps the most significant mismatch when it comes to supply, demand and consumption is probably more focused on the defensive rather than the offensive side. Because with all of those interceptors gone, the replacements have to come from somewhere. So on that note, let's talk air and missile defence. In simple terms, just about no one thinks they have enough of them, and trying to stock up is a slow and bloody expensive exercise. As the war in Ukraine played out with its massive Russian drone and missile attacks, a lot of countries got very interested in air defence readiness. And given the way the war in the Middle East has played out so far, I imagine that's likely just to add more fuel to that particular fire. Already, by 2023, European missile giant MBDA reported that about 70% of its new orders for the year were specifically for air defence systems or associated missiles. And what a lot of forces appear to have concluded is they really need good options across a spectrum. Everything from shorter-ranged gun or missile-based systems that you might use to defend not just against traditional threats like helicopters, but also loitering munitions and drones, up through mid-tier defences that might protect you from aircraft and cruise missiles, all the way up to top-end interceptors that you might use against high-cost ballistic missiles. We're also arguably seeing the emergence of a new, very expensive subcategory in the air defence market, which is tailored for a very demanding threat. These are hypersonic glide phase interceptors. The US and Japan have a joint program to develop one, for example, that are intended for the technically very demanding task of knocking down opposing hypersonic glide vehicles, as opposed to the current default defensive approach of intercepting them using their intended target. One of the tricks with air defence system demand, and the reason that all this can get very expensive very quickly, as ideally you probably want to be well equipped and capable at each tier, otherwise an opponent might take advantage of that gap to pry apart your system. We've seen this repeatedly in Ukraine, for example, when you might see a lower or mid-tier system that could be effective against a cruise missile, aircraft, or maybe a loitering munition, potentially being bullied by ballistic threats like Iskander that they can't really deal with. But we also have plenty of examples of the same problem occurring at the other end of the spectrum, where the Russians have set up something like an S-400 battery or a book that should be able to handle a lot of more complex threats, only for the Ukrainians to YOLO in with a couple of FPVs or loitering munitions and wipe the whole thing out for fractions of a cent on the dollar. What that suggests is that in an ideal world, you probably want a bit of everything. Passive defences like decoys, soft kill protection in the form of electronic warfare, then individual vehicle level protection like an APS or RWS, and then equipment all the way up the air defence tiering from your V-SHORAD and MANPADS options through to your low, middle, high, and dedicated counter-ballistic options. And if you look across those different market segments, the top competitors, if you like, are seldom the same. When it comes to MANPADS, for example, at least for a little while longer, America is still stuck on the Stinger. Issue 1, while updated, it's still a pretty old design. Issue 2, by modern standards, it's very expensive for what it is. And issue 3, even if the demand was there, the production to make it a major export success just isn't. The goal in 2025 was to lift production to a rate of about 60 a month, 720 a year. But that compares unfavourably to a number of cheaper European competitors. At the moment, the leading NATO manpads producer is probably actually Poland, with PGZ reportedly turning out about 1,300 Piorun shoulder-fired missiles per year with an intention to go further. Another missile that's seen a lot of demand from Ukraine, with about 5,000 ordered there, as well as some major international orders, including a £350 million deal with India, is the UK-manufactured Martlet. Compared to the flashier Starstreak, Martlet can't fly as fast, but it can fly further, and it has a simpler unitary warhead instead of the 3 hypervelocity darts, which makes it better optimised for performance against targets like drones, as opposed to fixed-wing aircraft. It's also considerably cheaper than something like Stinger, so for buyers that might have drones as a potential threat in mind, which frankly should be everyone in 2026, unless there's a separate compelling reason, like already having it in service or having it integrated with some of your existing platforms, I think we can probably expect to see European suppliers take up more of the manpads market, unless or until the United States can solve Stinger's cost and availability problems or come out with something entirely new. Moving up a tier, we have a niche which faded away in a lot of forces after the end of the Cold War, but with the emergence of loitering munitions and low-cost one-way attack drones, think the classic Shaheds, have had a bit of a renaissance. These are gun-based or gun and missile-based short-range air defence systems. Attractive for forces because throwing a handful of lead, even if it's computerised lead with a proximity fuse at something, is often going to be a cheaper way of trying to knock something out of the sky than letting rip with anything that has a rocket motor. In terms of systems we saw get a lot of attention or make sales in 2025, there are 2 that stand out, and once again, both of them are European. Not so much because there aren't alternatives out there, but because they haven't really made their way onto the international market at scale. The Russian Pantsir used to be a significant export success, but at the moment, the Russian Defense Ministry probably has priority over most of that production. And while there are also Chinese systems, for example, as we covered last episode, Chinese systems generally just don't have very good market penetration, at least just yet. That leaves 2 very different example systems to look at. Trident Mark II is basically what happens if you take a Bofors 40mm and strap it to the back of a truck, with the sales tagline on the website, given the history of the gun, literally being "fighting bad guys since 1936. Given it's a truck-mounted system, it's obviously not so much meant to operate right up near the forward edge of the battle area. The trade-off being trucks tend to be kinda cheap, which is not something you can say for this German system, which is intended to operate closer to the front line. This is the Sky Ranger, or at least a type of Sky Ranger, with it basically consisting of different turrets and weapon sets that you can fit to your vehicle of choice. Here you've got an example using the German Boxer, for all of your armoured mobile V-SHORAD needs. The expectation is the German military in particular is likely to buy these things in quantity. What remains to be seen though is how many other countries decide to go down this kind of route. Well, I think it being notable that Ukraine's experience using these kind of systems is mostly in the static infrastructure defence role, not so much as mobile frontline systems. And I think it's important to note here, based on what we've seen in Ukraine, while something like this might work very, very well against a longer range one-way attack drone like a Shahed, or a larger, higher-flying loitering munition, if you're close enough to the front line that you have to worry about things like small fibre optic FPVs that might be skimming very close to the ground, even your expensive SHORAD system might need a different answer to protect it from that problem. Moving up the cost tier yet again, you have missile systems that are designed to engage things like fixed-wing aircraft and cruise missiles, but don't have the longer range of something like an S-300 style strategic SAM, nor the anti-ballistic capability of something like a Patriot. Here, there's a couple we saw make major sales in 2024 and 2025, which can basically be separated by the family of missiles they fire, with the missile flavours being American, British, French, or German. NASAMS is popular, in part because it can use 2 missiles that many NATO nations already have significant stocks of, AIM-9 Sidewinder and the AIM-120 AMRAAM. It's also been flying off the metaphorical shells far faster than it can be manufactured, basically guaranteeing that further down the line, we're going to have to talk about Norway as a major arms exporter. A combined 2025 order for Belgium and Luxembourg covered 10 batteries at a cost of about 2.5 billion euros, while in late 2024 the Netherlands announced an intention to spend about $1 billion on a combination of new static NASAMS launchers and also the mobile version Nomads, with one of the key selling points here, as I mentioned earlier, being the plug-and-play nature of the system with available American munitions. British systems like Skysaber also employ that mix-and-match techniques when it comes to missile supply, although in this case it's with the CAM interceptor that's used by a number of European warships. Here you have a bunch of missiles that were ordered for the most part back in 2023 that haven't manifested in the 2025 data yet. According to SIPRI, about 2,000 in total for just that year, 1,300 for Poland, 270 for Sweden, 400 for the Saudis and 100 for the Ukrainians, that they started receiving in 2024. So basically, you're looking at a European vertical launching air defence system that takes advantage of the production scale provided by using a missile that's already in use by another service, which makes it fairly likely, I think, that we see it come up against competition from a European vertical launching air defence system that takes advantage of the economies of scale that come from using a missile used by another service. The French do something similar with their vertical launch Mica system, as did the Germans with this veteran of the war in Ukraine, IRIS-T. Just in 2025, SIPRI tracked orders for about 20 batteries of these things that haven't yet shown up in the transfer data. To give a sense of scale, the target production rate is reportedly about 10 batteries in 2026, and then 16 batteries, I believe, in 2028. And while for the moment, it's mostly been proving itself as a relatively short-range air defence system effective against cruise missiles and drones in Ukraine, the Germans are marketing it on the basis that if you buy these launchers, you may in the future be able to plug a longer-range missile into it. Just as the British offer both CAM and CAM-ER for Skysaber, the German plan is to offer the longer SLX missile to extend the range of the system from 40 to 80 kilometres and engagement altitude from 20 to 30 kilometres. At the moment, though, it's still a bit like buying an EV on the basis that the self-driving features will arrive eventually. The short and medium-range missiles, SLS and SLM, are very real, with a reported current production rate of somewhere between 800 and 1,000 per year. SLX is still a little bit further away, and those SLM missiles are unlikely to be the first choice of countries that are concerned with anti-ballistic protection, which, as we've seen in the Middle East, a couple of countries probably have reason to be concerned about. Against those kind of targets, the technical challenge is greater, the market offerings are more narrow, and so at least in the short term, I think we can expect to see demand for established solutions like Patriot PAC-3 interceptors basically being as many as Lockheed Martin can produce. The US likely doesn't feel it has enough of the things. The war in the Middle East has potentially chewed through a four-figure sum of them in a matter of weeks, and on top of that, you have the Ukrainians bartering for every spare interceptor they can find. That's not because the PAC-3 interceptor is cheap. $4 million per shot is probably an acceptable rule of thumb at this point. It's also not because it always works. We've seen both the Iranians and the Russians able to get ballistic missiles through defence systems. But they are an option, and where the alternative might be having a ballistic missile hit a valuable piece of infrastructure, like Qatar's LNG facilities, or a Ukrainian power plant or arms factory, shot exchange math can get crushed by economic warfare math fairly quickly. So if you're expecting transatlantic tensions to result in the US delivering fewer Patriot interceptors, I probably wouldn't hold your breath, with the latest news being that the US is intending to increase production of the missile from 600 to about 2,000 units per year. A lot, sure, but probably not enough to meet the entire market requirement, which is where the opportunity for alternatives potentially comes in. Because even if you want and can afford Patriot, it's probably not going to do too much effective defending if it's still on back order at the time enemy missiles and aircraft start to arrive. So the question is, if countries are trying to diversify or if there's a significant backlog, what might they potentially go for instead? We've talked about Russian, Chinese and Israeli alternatives in the past, but for a lot of countries, those aren't going to be the first preference, which I think leaves two systems to watch going forward, one European and one Korean. In recent European competitions, we've often seen Patriot matched up and evaluated against the Israeli David Sling and the Franco-Italian SAMP-T, a relatively long-range air defence system with some anti-ballistic capability, leveraging Aster interceptors that many European states are already going to have in inventory for their navies. In 2025, we saw SAMP-T go head-to-head with the American Patriot to sell 2 batteries to Denmark. The Danes had already been in the process of basically bolting together an air defence system since the Russian invasion, bringing together a medium-range component that consisted of everything they can get their hands on. NASAMS, IRIS-T from Germany, and also a French system we didn't talk about, the vertical launch Mica. The win in Denmark gave the very new system an additional customer, while Ukraine has helpfully volunteered itself as the testing ground, with the Ukrainians claiming they intend to test SAMP-T and G against Russian ballistic missiles this year. In some ways, you could argue here the French and Italians might have started work on a solution before the problem really presented itself. In a world where air defence threats weren't considered acute and American interceptors were freely available, it might have been harder for a European competitor to get the scale needed to really break into the market successfully. With the combination of some of those major events we talked about earlier in the episode, it really is a bit of a perfect storm for anyone that has this kind of system on the market. And speaking of scale, the manufacturer of those missiles, MBDA, has stated their intention is to boost overall missile output by about 40% in 2026, with the Aster itself expected to see a 100% increase. And there's a reason I keep coming back to the S word here: scale. Historically speaking, one of the huge advantages major players in the arms market, be that the Soviet Union and later Russia or the United States, have often had, is that they can embrace economies of scale to produce things cheaper than they otherwise would be. But at a practical level, when it comes to things like missiles, there really can be discrete breakpoints. And what we're seeing now, and might see more of as a result of the war in the Middle East, is more producers outside Russia, the United States, or People's Republic of China able to hit those breakpoints. If you listen to the CEO of MBDA talk about the way Aster is produced, for example, he has pretty much outright said the original production model was never intended for mass production. And so you might have, for example, individual pieces of machinery being used to support production of multiple different types of missiles at the same time, which is generally going to be less efficient than what they're able to do now, which is you specialize your people and your capital, you tell them to produce one thing and produce it as fast as they can. Because there's a strong demand signal for Aster, MBDA has been able to order more specialized machinery. And so what that potentially means several years down the track is that some of these European systems are operating at less of what you might call an industrial disadvantage compared to American or Russian competitors. But especially if the wars in the Middle East and Ukraine continue as they have been, even that might not be enough to meet market demand, which is where I think we might want to watch for Seoul coming off the bench with the steel chair, because as we mentioned in a previous episode, they also have a medium-range air defense system. It also claims to be capable of intercepting ballistic threats. And while we're still in the very early stages of mostly anecdotal reports, the claim is that in the UAE, the Cheonggung-2 air defense system claimed an interception rate starting with a 9 against Iranian targets. The reason I'd expect this system to show up in future sales data then is basically threefold. One, you're going to have countries rushing to buy whatever they can get their hands on, and this is something they can potentially get their hands on. Two, while like-for-like comparisons between contracts are difficult, I do think it's fairly safe to say the Koreans have the cheaper option here. If an American PAC-3 is worth about $4 million, an interceptor for the Cheonggung-2 might set you back maybe very roughly 1/3 of that. Meaning, all else being equal, you might be able to afford more interceptors, more offensive options to go alongside your defensive ones, or, more critical infrastructure for those missile systems to defend in the first place. The Koreans, like the Germans, also intend to essentially upgun their missile system by later introducing a longer-range missile that you can launch from the same platform. That would potentially break them into the final, most expensive segment of the market, where the number of available competitors is still fairly limited. When it comes to very high-altitude interceptors that you might want to use against something like a Russian or Iranian medium-range ballistic missile, a lot of countries at the moment just don't have a direct competitor. The Israelis have the likes of Arrow 3, the Americans THAAD, and then for naval employment, you also have the American SM-3. At this point, we're starting to talk about very expensive missiles. For a Talon for THAAD, or the blingiest version of SM-3, get ready to cough up something in the 8-figure range. Meaning you better be really, really sure before you pull the trigger that what you're defending is really worth defending. Perhaps unsurprisingly given the price point though, production volumes here tend to be fairly low. The US and Japan are both publicly committed to dialing up SM-3 production, for example, but the stated target number being thrown around back in 2025 was only about 100 units per year eventually, which on one hand might be a lot if you're a taxpayer, but not so many if you're expecting your opponent to potentially pull an Iran or worse and throw out more than 1,000 ballistic missiles in the first few weeks of a war. Until we start to see more genuine competitors enter the market though, I think it's likely that at least for the short term, we continue to see the Americans and Israelis lead here. So in summary then, looking forward, where does the war in Iran and the developments of 2025 leave us when it comes to the future of the air defense market? I think the most likely result here is that you see a situation where short-term demand massively outstrips short-term supply, which might encourage countries to diversify or change suppliers simply to get their hands on what they need as soon as possible. That might mean that alternatives from Europe, Korea, or even providers like Russia and China might be able to scale up more and secure greater success than they would in a world where none of this happened. Because to be clear, I don't think a likely outcome here is that we see US arms transfers collapse the same way we saw Russia's did. Quite the contrary, the pipeline there is very strong, and the impact on some of the US most valuable export categories like aircraft is likely to be minimal or even positive. The argument is more that if you proceed on the assumption that the Gulf states, Israel and the US will want to replace the munitions they've been expending as fast as possible, there just isn't enough slack production capacity out there at the moment to do that, while still vacuuming up all the potential export demand in Asia, among the European NATO allies, or in Ukraine. What that suggests is you might see other countries try to move to take advantage of that gap and use these years as an opportunity to build up the production lines and scales necessary to be more formidable competitors several years down the track, even when the global environment starts to calm down a bit. Whether that happens, of course, is still very much up in the air. And just as we didn't see some of the impacts of 2022 until 2025, it may be 2030 before we have all the data necessary to prove things one way or the other. With one massive unknown we'll come back to soon, being just how all of this plays out. How long do Iranian ballistic missiles keep getting launched? And how many interceptors have to be fired against them? How quickly do the Gulf states decide they need replacements? And who, if anyone, is the Pentagon willing to bump down the queue in order to restock their own magazines first? And if the straits remain closed and energy prices remain elevated, what implications might that potentially have for national budgets and the ambitious rearmament plans we've seen develop since 2022? What seems clear is that if we were already in an air defence interceptor squeeze in 2025, 2026 is in the process of really amping things up for the sequel. But beyond that, only time and the eventual data release will tell. Which brings us to a channel update to close out, which I hope, given the circumstances, you'll forgive me for keeping a bit briefer than normal. As I said near the start, as I'm recording this, I'm currently recovering from surgery, which, good news, went really well, and so should mean hopefully fewer problems in the future, with the obvious downside being that recovery is never quite as quick as you'd hope it would be. That helped shape the decision to do more of a shorter Part 2 style episode this week, but my hope is we should be back to a regular schedule this Sunday. On that, thank you very much all of you for your patience and your ongoing support and engagement. I genuinely appreciate it, and I do hope that with any luck, I'll see you all later this week.